Welcome to Lyra Echo Stories, where every story echoes emotions, memories, and hidden truths. Step in and feel the echo of every tale.
My husband said, "I love your sister. I'm better with her." He filed for divorce and married her. A week later, a lawyer called me. "Your father died and left you 88 million. What my ex-husband did when he found out. Welcome back, dear listeners. It's Briella again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end and let me know which city you're listening from. That way, I can see how far my story has traveled. I used to believe I had the kind of life most women quietly envy. Not perfect. Nothing ever is, but solid, real. The kind of life you build brick by brick over 12 years, and then stand back and think, yes, this is mine. My name is Claire Maddox. I was 38 years old, living in a 4-bedroom house in Naperville, Illinois, with a yard that bloomed every April, and a kitchen I had renovated myself, tile by tile. I worked as a project manager for a mid-sized architecture firm downtown, commuting 40 minutes each way on the Metro. I made good money. I kept the house. I paid half the mortgage. My husband, Danny, I called him back then, was a sales director for a pharmaceutical distribution company. We met at 26, married at 27, and for most of those 12 years, I thought we were fine. Not electric, not honeymoon wild, but fine. Steady, committed, the kind of couple that makes it. We didn't have children. That was a grief we'd both made peace with, or so I believed. We traveled instead, Prague, Lisbon, a long week in New Mexico that I still think about when I need to remember who I was before everything changed. My sister, Renee, was 34. 4 years younger, and she'd always moved in and out of my life the way younger siblings sometimes do. Close for a while, then distant, then close again. She was charming, funny, the kind of woman who fills a room without trying. She'd had a rough few years, a broken engagement, a career pivot, a move back to the Chicago area after a stint in Atlanta. Around 18 months before everything fell apart, she started coming around more. Sunday dinners, birthday parties, long evenings on the back porch with wine and Danny's cooking. I welcomed it. I missed her. I was glad she'd come back. Looking back now, I can see every sign I chose not to read. Can you really blame yourself for not suspecting your own sister? Can you blame yourself for trusting the man who shared your bed for 12 years? The first moment I felt something shift was on a Wednesday evening in October. I'd come home from work an hour early. A meeting had been canceled, and pulled into the garage to find Renee's silver Civic in the driveway. Not unusual, she had a key. She'd used it before. But when I walked in through the mudroom, the house was quiet in a way that felt different from empty. There were 2 wine glasses on the kitchen island. Not the cheap everyday ones, but the good Riedels we saved for company. A half-finished bottle of Pinot between them. I stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment, listening. Then I called out, "Hey, anyone home?" There was a pause. Just a fraction too long. And then Renee's voice came from the direction of the living room. "In here." "Didn't hear you pull in." Danny was on the couch, Renee in the armchair across from him, both fully dressed, nothing outwardly wrong. Danny smiled at me and said he'd invited her by to talk about surprising me for my upcoming birthday. It sounded plausible. It was exactly the kind of thing he would have done once. But something in my chest tightened and didn't let go. Over the next 3 months, the feeling grew. Small things accumulated. Danny started going to the gym in the evenings instead of mornings, a change he explained as a scheduling conflict at work. His phone, which had always lived face up on the coffee table, began living in his pocket. He started laughing differently when Renee was in the room. Not louder, differently. More relaxed, more open, the way people laugh when they feel safe. Renee, for her part, started canceling our standing Thursday lunches. She was busy, she said. New freelance contract. I didn't push. I noticed. I noticed everything. But I said nothing because what was there to say? I have a feeling. Feelings aren't evidence. And I still, God help me, I still trusted them both enough to believe I was probably wrong. Then came the evening in January that I will never forget for the rest of my life. Danny and I were in the kitchen after dinner. He was loading the dishwasher. I was making tea. He turned around, leaned against the counter, crossed his arms, and said, in the same flat, rehearsed voice someone uses when they've practiced a sentence 50 times, "Claire, I need to tell you something. I love Renee. I'm in love with her. I've been in love with her for almost a year. Being with her, it's different than anything I've ever had. I'm sorry." I set down my mug. I remember the sound of the refrigerator hum. I remember the cold of the tile floor through my socks. I remember thinking, so it was real. Not, this can't be happening. Just, so it was real. He said something after that about filing papers, about hoping I could understand, about not wanting things to be ugly. I said nothing. I walked upstairs, sat on the edge of our bed in the dark, and thought very carefully about what my life was now and what I intended to do about it. I did not cry that night. I know that sounds like something people say to seem strong, but it's the truth. I simply didn't. I sat on that bed for a long time, and what I felt wasn't grief, not yet. It was something colder and more precise. It was the feeling of a spreadsheet opening in your mind. I slept in the guest room. Danny knocked on the door once, around 11, and I told him through the wood that I wasn't ready to talk. He went away. By 6 in the morning, I was dressed in the kitchen and going through the filing cabinet we kept in the home office. Here is what I knew about our financial situation. We owned the house jointly, purchased in 2016 for $485,000, now worth somewhere north of $590,000 based on recent comps in the neighborhood. We had a joint savings account, a joint checking account, and a joint brokerage account that I had largely funded over the past 4 years from my own bonuses and salary increases. Danny had a 401k through his employer. I had one through mine. We had no prenuptial agreement. We were 27 and in love, and the idea had felt insulting at the time. I sat at the kitchen table with my legal pad and wrote down every number I could find. The brokerage account, $214,000. The savings, $47,000. My personal 401k, $189,000. His. I didn't know the exact figure, but I knew he'd been contributing for 9 years at a company that matched generously. The equity in the house, roughly $160,000 after what remained on the mortgage. I was not a woman without resources. I wanted to remember that clearly, even through the fear. Because there was fear. Let me not pretend otherwise. I was 38 years old, childless, about to divorce the man I'd built 12 years around, and the betrayal had come not from a stranger, but from my own blood, from the sister I had welcomed back into my life, fed at my table, given a key to my house. That kind of wound doesn't present itself all at once. It comes in waves, and when the first wave hit me at the kitchen table that morning, not the anger, but the raw, animal grief of it, I had to put my pen down and breathe through my nose for a full minute before I could continue. Then I picked the pen back up. I called in sick to work. I drove instead to the Starbucks on Washington Street 3 miles from the house because I needed to be somewhere Danny wasn't. I ordered a coffee I barely tasted and opened my laptop. The first search I ran was Best Divorce Attorneys, Naperville, Illinois Women. I read reviews for 2 hours. I made a short list of 3 names. I called the office of Margaret Holloway Family Law at 9:15 a.m. and made an appointment for the following Thursday. Then I did something I hadn't planned, but immediately knew was right. I called my closest friend, Diane, who lived in Evanston and had been through her own divorce 6 years earlier. I told her in 3 sentences what had happened: Danny, Renee, the kitchen, last night. There was a long silence on the phone. "Do not move out of that house," Diane said. "Whatever you do, don't leave. And don't touch the joint accounts until you talk to a lawyer." I wrote both things down. I spent the rest of that day quietly documenting. I photographed financial statements from the filing cabinet before Danny came home. I forwarded account statements to my personal email. I noted dates, amounts, account numbers. I wasn't planning anything illegal or vindictive. I was simply ensuring that the picture I had was complete and could not be revised by anyone else later. Danny came home at 6. We ate dinner in near silence. He tried once to begin a conversation about the timeline, about the apartment he said he was looking at, about how he hoped we could be adult about everything. I told him I had retained an attorney. I hadn't yet, but I was going to. And that all future discussions about the division of assets should go through her. He looked surprised, as if he had expected me to be destroyed enough not to function. That look told me everything I needed to know about how he had planned this. He had not planned for me to be organized. He had not planned for me to be calm. He thought he was leaving a woman who would dissolve, who would be too devastated, too humiliated to think clearly about what was hers. He was wrong. By the end of that week, I had my first appointment with Margaret Holloway confirmed. I had a personal folder, encrypted, on a USB drive with every financial document I had been able to locate. I had not confronted Renee. I had not called my mother. I had not posted anything on social media. I had not told anyone except Diane. I had done what I always did when something needed to be built. I had drawn the blueprint first. The plan was simple, and it was clean. Protect what was mine, document what had happened, and let the law do what it was designed to do. No theatrics, no revenge fantasies. Just the quiet, methodical work of a woman who knew how to finish what she started. Margaret Holloway's office was on the 2nd floor of a converted Victorian on Jefferson Avenue, the kind of building that signals competence without ostentation. Bookshelves floor to ceiling, diplomas in simple frames, a desk that had clearly seen 20 years of difficult conversations. Margaret herself was 50-something, silver-haired, with the particular composure of someone who has heard every version of human betrayal and judged none of them. I sat across from her with my USB drive, my legal pad, and 12 years of marriage reduced to a folder of numbers. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "You've done this correctly. Most people come in here having already made 3 mistakes. You haven't made any." She walked me through the Illinois divorce framework. Equitable distribution. Not equal, but equitable, based on contribution, duration of marriage, earning capacity. The house. Because I had contributed significantly to the mortgage and the renovation, and because we'd been married over 10 years, I had a strong claim to a substantial share of the equity. The brokerage account, my contributions were documentable, which mattered. His 401k, subject to a qualified domestic relations order, meaning I could claim a portion proportional to the years of marriage. She confirmed what Diane had told me. Stay in the house. Do not drain joint accounts. Document everything. She also said something I hadn't considered. If the affair can be demonstrated to have involved your marital property, if he spent joint funds on her, took her on trips you paid for, used shared resources to conduct the relationship, that's relevant to equitable distribution in Illinois. I drove home thinking about that. That evening, I did something I had been putting off. I sat at the kitchen table after Danny had gone to his home office to work. and I went through our joint credit card statements for the past 18 months, all of them available through the online account portal, all of them downloadable as PDFs. I was looking for irregularities. I found them. Dinners at restaurants I had never been to. A hotel in downtown Chicago. One night, last March, charged to the joint card before Danny had apparently thought to use a different one. After March, the restaurant charges disappeared from the joint card. But I found something else. 2 charges to a florist I didn't recognize, both in the spring. A weekend charge at a bed and breakfast in Galena the previous September. I had been in Denver for a conference that weekend. I had been in Denver and he had taken my sister to Galena. I sat very still for a long time. I had thought the affair was perhaps 6 months old. 8 months, maybe. A recent collapse of boundaries, something that had escalated gradually over the previous winter. The Galena charge was dated 14 months ago. 14 months? I calculated backward. That placed the beginning of this, whatever this was, in the early fall of the year before, around the time Renee had started coming to Sunday dinners again. Around the time I had welcomed her back. I downloaded every statement. I highlighted every charge. I put it all on the USB drive. The next day, a Saturday, Danny went to the gym in the morning. Or said he did. I noticed that Renee didn't respond to my text message until 3 hours after I sent it, which meant nothing on its own, except that she always responded quickly. The small, consistent patterns of a person who has something to hide. What I did not do was confront either of them. They had both, I realized, been waiting for me to erupt. In the 2 weeks since Danny's kitchen confession, he had been living in the house with a kind of wary watchfulness. Coming home on time, being polite at dinner, volunteering for small domestic tasks as if normalcy could cushion what he'd done. He expected grief. He expected scenes. He expected me to call Renee screaming. Instead, I had been very calm, very contained, and had started keeping a locked door between myself and anyone who didn't need to know what I was building. Renee called that Saturday afternoon. Her voice was careful. That particular brand of careful that means someone has rehearsed the call. She said she wanted to talk. She said she was so sorry. She said she knew how this looked, and she wanted me to understand that she never intended. "I'll call you back," I said. "I'm in the middle of something." I wasn't, but I needed her to wait. I needed both of them to keep waiting and wondering what Claire was doing, what Claire was thinking, why Claire wasn't falling apart. Because I wasn't falling apart. Not yet. Not until I had everything I needed. Margaret Holloway filed the petition for dissolution of marriage on my behalf the following Tuesday. Illinois law required a waiting period, which I understood. That was fine. I had time. What I had now, more importantly, was a case, documented, organized, time-stamped, and in the hands of a woman who knew exactly what to do with it. The hotel in Chicago, the florist charges, the weekend in Galena while I was in Denver. 14 months. That was the number I kept returning to. Not because it changed the fundamental betrayal, but because it confirmed something important. This was not a moment of weakness. This was a choice, made over and over again for more than a year inside my home, at my table, with my wine glasses and my sister's smile. Now it was my turn to make choices. The divorce filing became real to Danny on a Wednesday morning when his attorney, a man named Carl Brewer, whom Margaret had dealt with before and described as aggressive but not creative, called her office to confirm receipt of the petition. By noon that day, Danny had come home from work early. I was in the kitchen when I heard the garage door. I stayed where I was, at the island, with a cup of coffee and the case timeline Margaret had given me to review. I had known this conversation was coming. I had, in a way, been waiting for it. He came through the mudroom door and stood in the kitchen entrance, and for a moment he just looked at me, as if he'd expected to find me different, undone, maybe, more visibly damaged. "You filed," he said. "Yes," I said, without even talking to me first. I looked at him. "Danny, you told me in this kitchen that you're in love with my sister. What exactly did you think we were going to talk through?" He sat down across from me. His tone shifted, not softer, but more calculated. He said that he'd been reviewing their finances with Carl and that he wanted to discuss the brokerage account in particular. He said that a significant portion of the funds in that account had come from his income during years when I had been earning less, and that he expected that to be reflected in the settlement. I said, "My attorney will respond to your attorney." He pressed. He said that if I was going to make this adversarial, he would have no choice but to contest the equitable distribution claim on the house. That his attorney had advised him that my renovation contributions might not be as documentable as I thought. "They're very documentable," I said. "I have receipts going back 7 years." There was a silence. Then, "I also think we need to talk about what you've been telling people." I hadn't told anyone except Diane and Margaret. I said so. He didn't believe me, I could tell. He'd expected gossip, social fallout, the scorned wife performance. When none of it had materialized, he'd apparently decided I must be running some kind of behind-the-scenes campaign. He left after an hour, having achieved nothing. But the real confrontation came 2 days later. I was in the backyard on a Saturday morning when Renee's Civic pulled into the driveway. I watched from the yard as she got out. And then Danny got out from the passenger side. So, they had come together. I met them at the back gate, and I will say this for myself. I did not let them inside the house. I stood at the gate, arms at my sides, and let them talk. Renee's approach was emotional. She cried. She said she never meant to hurt me. She said that what she and Danny had was real, and she couldn't pretend otherwise. But she didn't want to lose me as her sister. She said she loved me. She said the word love 4 times in under 3 minutes, which is the kind of thing you notice when you've stopped trusting the person saying it. Then Danny spoke, and his tone was no longer careful. He said that if I pushed this to a full trial, if I contested everything and dragged it out, it would be expensive, humiliating, and ultimately I would walk away with less than if we settled now. He said his attorney had done an analysis. He said he was offering me the house equity and half the savings account, and that I should take it and be done. He was offering me less than what I was legally entitled to and presenting it as generosity. I looked at him for a moment. I looked at my sister. I thought about the Galena bed and breakfast. I thought about the florist's charges. I thought about the 14 months. "I'll let Margaret know you're interested in discussing settlement terms," I said. "You can have that conversation through her." Renee reached out and touched my arm. "Claire," I stepped back. "Don't," I said. "Not yet. Maybe not ever. But definitely not today." They left. I went inside and stood in the kitchen until my hands stopped trembling. Not from fear, but from the physical effort of staying calm when every instinct was screaming. I had held the line, but holding lines is exhausting, and I was tired in a way that went deeper than sleep could reach. I called Margaret that afternoon and told her about the visit. She was not pleased. Direct contact outside of counsel was something she'd address with Brewer. But she also told me the visit had revealed something useful. They were nervous. People who are confident in their position don't show up in pairs to pressure you in your own backyard. That week, I took Thursday and Friday off work. I drove up to Lake Geneva alone, rented a small room at a quiet inn, and walked along the lake in the November cold for 2 days. I didn't check my email. I didn't call anyone. I ate dinner alone both nights and slept more deeply than I had in months. When I came back Sunday evening, I felt something I hadn't felt in weeks. Solid. Like something that had been loose inside me had settled back into place. The house was still mine. The case was still building. And I had just watched two people who had planned this very carefully for 14 months panic within 3 weeks of being held accountable. I slept in my own bed that night. My house, my bed. And I did not dream of either of them. The call from Renee came on a Tuesday, 12 days after they had shown up in my driveway together. She didn't cry this time. That had clearly not worked. Instead, she was quiet, almost tentative, the version of Renee I remembered from when we were teenagers, before she became good at performing. She said she'd been doing a lot of thinking. She said she knew she had no right to ask anything of me. She said she was calling because she missed me. Not to argue, not to defend herself, just because I was her sister, and she missed me, and she didn't know if that was allowed to matter anymore. I listened to all of it. I noticed the craftsmanship of it, the specific emotional levers she was pressing, the shared childhood, the sister bond, the appeal to what we'd had before Danny existed in either of our lives. I miss who you were before this, I said, but I don't know if that person is who you actually are. She was quiet. I'm not ready to talk, I said. Maybe someday. Not now. And I ended the call. Danny's approach came 3 days later through a mutual friend named Greg, who worked in his industry and had been part of our social circle for years. Greg called a bit awkwardly and said Danny had reached out to him, that Danny wanted me to know he regretted how things had gone in the backyard, that he hadn't meant to be threatening, that he just wanted this to be civil. Greg, to his credit, was transparent about the fact that Danny had asked him to relay this. He also said, and I could hear the discomfort in his voice, Claire, I'm not going to be in the middle of this. I just thought you should know he made contact. I appreciate you telling me, I said. You don't have to do anything else. I noted it, I told Margaret, who noted it too. What I found in those weeks was something I hadn't fully expected. My people came. Not in the dramatic rallying around a crisis way, not with casseroles and collective outrage, but steadily, quietly, in the way that real support actually works. Diane drove down from Evanston on a Saturday, and we spent the afternoon at my kitchen table going through nothing important, just talking, drinking coffee, existing in the same space. She didn't push me to feel anything specific. She was just there. A colleague named Priya at work, who had gone through a painful separation 2 years earlier, started checking in with small, deliberate kindnesses. A coffee left on my desk. A text on difficult days that said only, thinking of you. No need to respond. It was the no need to respond that meant the most. My mother was harder. She had called when she found out. From Danny, who had apparently told her before he told me he was filing. My mother and Renee had always had a particular closeness, the kind that formed between a mother and a younger child who needed more. And when I told her, as calmly as I could, what had happened, I heard in her silence the grief of a woman who didn't know which daughter to stand beside. She didn't choose Renee over me, but she didn't fully choose me either. She occupied a neutral, pained middle ground that I found, honestly, more exhausting than open conflict would have been. I gave her space. I called her every Sunday, kept the calls brief, let her find her footing in her own time. What I did not do was collapse socially. I did not retreat. I went to work. I went to the grocery store. I had dinner with Diane and with Priya and with 2 other women I trusted. I showed up to my life clearly and consistently because I had come to understand that the worst thing I could give Danny and Renee was the sight of me diminished. They had expected me to fall apart in public. The fact that I hadn't, the fact that I was calm, that I was functional, that I was moving through my days with something that looked like composure. This unsettled them more than grief would have. Grief is legible. It confirms the power of the person who caused it. Composure is something else. Composure says, "You do not have that power over me." And increasingly, it was true. I wasn't performing calm anymore. Something had solidified in me during those 2 days at Lake Geneva. Some internal rearrangement had taken place, and what I felt now, most of the time, wasn't anger or sorrow. It was focus. Clear, cold, purposeful focus. Margaret called that week with an update. Danny's attorney had sent a revised settlement proposal, which was slightly better than the backyard ultimatum, but still significantly below what we expected to achieve at trial. She recommended we decline and proceed. I said, "Decline." She said, "Good." I said, "Margaret, when this is done, I want it done completely. Nothing lingering, nothing ambiguous. I want a clean line." She said, "That's what we're going to get." I believed her. They came back on a Sunday in December. I didn't buzz them in. I opened the front door before they reached the porch because I had seen Renee's car turn onto the street from the upstairs window, and I had had time to compose myself. I had used that time deliberately. I stood at the upstairs window for a full minute, watching the car idle at the curb before either of them got out. And I thought about what they were about to try, and I decided exactly how I would respond. By the time I came downstairs, I was ready. I stood in the doorway. I did not invite them inside. Danny was wearing the camel coat I had given him 2 Christmases ago. I noticed this in the way you notice specific details when your mind is very, very clear. Renee spoke first. Her tone was warm, practiced, calibrated. She said they'd been talking, both of them, and they'd realized they'd been handling this all wrong. She said they didn't want a legal war. She said they wanted to sit down with me, the 3 of us, without attorneys, and figure out something that worked for everyone. She said she hated what this was doing to the family. "What family?" I asked. A brief pause. She blinked. I watched her recalibrate. Then Danny stepped in. He said that if this went to trial, there were things that would come out that he didn't think any of us wanted public. He said, and here he was, careful with his words, which told me he and Brewer had discussed this, that the discovery process could become very broad, that it might involve not just financials, but potentially other aspects of both parties' histories. He let the implication hang between us, heavy and deliberate. He wasn't naming anything specific. He didn't need to. The implication was clear. Agree to our terms, or we'll dig for something to use against you. I looked at him. I thought about whether there was anything, any decision I'd made, any account I'd opened, anything in 12 years of marriage, that could be used as leverage. I went through it quickly, the way you do when you've already run the calculation several times before. There was nothing. My finances were straightforward. My conduct had been, by any measure, unremarkable. I had nothing to hide, and more importantly, I had a credit card statement with a bed and breakfast charge from Galena and a hotel receipt from downtown Chicago. "I think you should talk to Margaret," I said. "If Carl wants to pursue discovery, Margaret will be very happy to pursue it thoroughly, from both directions." Renee's composure cracked slightly. "Claire, we're not trying to threaten you. We're trying to—" "I know what you're trying to do," I said. "You're trying to get me to settle quickly and cheaply because you've realized the documentation is bad for you. That's not going to happen. Danny's jaw tightened. You're making this so much harder than it needs to be. No, I said. You made it hard. I'm just making sure it's fair. He said something then. Lower, quieter. The voice he used when he was genuinely angry rather than performing anger. He said that he had spent 12 years building a life with me, that the business of that life belonged to both of them, and that I was going to spend a lot of money finding out how little I was going to end up with. He added, almost as an afterthought, that Brewer had handled cases far more complex than this one, and that I should consider very carefully what kind of process I was inviting. It was the afterthought that told me the most. That was the real threat. Not dressed up, not softened. Just be careful. Then they left. I closed the door. I went to the kitchen. I sat down. For a few minutes, I will not pretend otherwise. I was afraid. Not the theatrical fear of someone in a movie, but the small, concrete fear of a person who understands that legal battles are unpredictable, that money runs out, that even righteous causes can lose on procedural grounds. What if he had something? What if Brewer was better than I thought? What if I spent the next year fighting and came out the other side with less than what they were offering now? I sat with that fear for probably 10 minutes, and then something happened that I can only describe as a clarification. I thought about Galena. I thought about the florist charges in April, which I now knew corresponded to a weekend I had worked overtime to cover a project deadline, while Danny sent my sister flowers. I thought about the way they'd arrived in my driveway together, and the way they'd just arrived on my porch together, and the way they were still, even now, treating me as a problem to be managed rather than a person they had wronged. The fear didn't disappear, but it changed shape. It became something harder and more useful. I called Diane that evening. I told her what had happened. She was angry in the crisp, focused way that good friends get angry on your behalf. "What do you need?" she asked. "Nothing right now," I said. I just needed to say it out loud to someone who was actually on my side. "You're going to win this," she said. I told her I intended to. That night, alone in my house, I reviewed Margaret's case notes one more time. The financial documentation was strong. The timeline was clear. The evidence of where joint funds had been spent was specific and verifiable. I had receipts. I had statements. I had dates and amounts and a forensic accountant who had already reviewed the preliminary spreadsheet and called it, in his professional opinion, airtight. Danny thought he was holding leverage. He wasn't. He was holding the illusion of leverage, and he had spent the last several weeks trying to convince me to be afraid of it. I had been afraid of it for about 10 minutes on a Sunday afternoon in December. Then I had decided I wasn't. The mediation session was scheduled for a Thursday in late January, 6 weeks after the December confrontation on my porch. I dressed carefully that morning. Not to impress, to anchor myself. A charcoal blazer I had bought before any of this had happened, a blouse that was simple and clean, low heels. I ate breakfast. I drove downtown. I arrived 11 minutes early, which was intentional because I wanted to be in the room before they were. The setting was a conference room at a neutral law firm in downtown Chicago. A glass-walled room on the 19th floor with a view of the lake and a long table with a mediator named Sandra Chu, who had been agreed upon by both attorneys. Margaret sat on my left. On the other side of the table, Danny, Carl Brewer, and, because Danny's settlement proposal involved a claim that Renee had contributed financially to our household over the past 18 months, which was a new and creative argument Brewer had apparently constructed. Renee, with her own counsel, a younger attorney named Torres. This was the first time I had been in a formal room with all of them at once. I had thought about this moment during many cold walks and sleepless hours, and what I had decided was simple. I would let Margaret and the documents do the talking. Carl opened. He presented their position. Equitable distribution should favor Danny because of his income contributions during early years of the marriage. The renovation costs I claimed were actually joint decisions that had simply been executed by me. And the brokerage account contained funds that had been accumulated before I had reached income parity with Danny. He was smooth. He had done this before. I noticed Renee watching me from across the table, and I did not return her look. I kept my eyes on Sandra Chu, who was taking notes in a small, precise hand. Then Margaret opened our response. She put 3 documents in front of Sandra Chu. The first was a spreadsheet, compiled by a forensic accountant Margaret had brought in, mapping every identifiable contribution to the joint brokerage account, back to its source account and paycheck. My contributions over the past 4 years outpaced Danny's by roughly 60%. The renovation expenditures were broken into individual receipts, each cross-referenced to my personal checking account, which had been separate from our joint accounts. The numbers did not argue. They simply sat there, row after row, and told the truth. The second document was the credit card statement analysis. 14 months of charges. The Galena bed and breakfast, the hotel in Chicago, the florist, 7 restaurant dinners at establishments neither of us had ever visited together. Every charge coded to date, cross-referenced against my calendar and travel records to confirm I had not been present. The joint card, marital funds, used to conduct an affair with my sister. The third document was a brief, factual summary. The divorce petition had been filed within 3 weeks of Danny's own voluntary disclosure of the affair to me. There was no period of attempted reconciliation, no contested history of my conduct, no counterclaim. Carl looked at the credit card analysis for a long moment. I watched him read it. I watched the quality of his stillness change. Danny's posture changed. It happened gradually and then all at once. The way composure breaks when someone realizes that the room knows what they did. He looked at the Galena charge. He looked at the hotel charge. He looked at the florist entry dated April 14th, which I had internally named the Denver Flowers, because I had been in Denver and he had sent my sister flowers with our money. "Those charges," he started. "Carl," Margaret said pleasantly, "your client is welcome to provide an alternative accounting of those expenditures at any time." Carl put his hand on Danny's arm, a small, firm gesture that said, "Stop talking. We'll review the documentation and respond in writing." But Danny was not finished. The careful, rehearsed version of him, the one who had stood in my kitchen and delivered his prepared speech, the one who had come to my porch with his camel coat and his calculated words, that version had left the room. What remained was someone who had, I think, genuinely believed he would never have to sit in a conference room and watch his choices laid out in rows on a spreadsheet. Watch a stranger read them. Watch a mediator write notes about them. He looked at me. "You've been building a case this whole time. While you were sitting at that dinner table, while you were going through the motions of our life, you were building a case." I looked back at him. I said very quietly, "Yes, that's—" He stopped. He shook his head. "That's not who you are." "Danny," I said, "you don't know who I am. You spent a year deciding you preferred someone else. You don't get to be surprised by what I'm like when I'm defending myself." Renee, across the table, said nothing. She had not said a single word since Sandra Chu had called the session to order. She was looking at the table surface. Her attorney, Torres, had his pen hovering over a notepad and wasn't writing anything because there was nothing to write. Their position had no document, no evidence, no architecture. It had been constructed on the assumption that I would be too destabilized to build one of my own. That assumption had been wrong. Sandra Chu gave them 15 minutes to confer privately with their attorneys. Margaret and I stepped into the hallway, and she bought us both coffee from the floor's machine. And she said, in the calm voice of someone who has seen this particular moment before, "They're going to settle." "Today?" I asked. "Maybe not today, but soon. Carl knows what that documentation does to their position in front of any judge in this state." She was right. It took 9 more days. The final settlement gave me 60% of the brokerage account, full equity on the house minus Danny's share of the remaining mortgage balance, and a QDRO on his 401k reflecting 10 of our 12 married years. I kept my own retirement accounts untouched. I paid Margaret's fees from the settlement funds and still came out substantially ahead of what Danny had offered me in the backyard in November. I signed the final documents on a Friday morning in February. I drove home alone. I parked in the garage and sat in the car for a few minutes, in the quiet, in the dark of the garage with the engine off, and I let the stillness of it be real. 12 years. Then I went inside and made coffee and opened my laptop and started looking at what the next thing was going to be. The call came on a Tuesday, 11 days after I signed the divorce papers. I was at work, in my office on the 14th floor, reviewing drawings for a commercial project in the West Loop. My personal cell buzzed with a number I didn't recognize, a 312 area code, downtown Chicago. I let it go to voicemail, finished my markup, and listened to the message 20 minutes later. "Ms. Maddox, this is Richard Aldrin from Aldrin and Pierce Estate Law. I'm calling regarding the estate of Gerald Maddox. I'd be grateful if you could return my call at your earliest convenience. My father." We had not been close. Not for years. He had remarried in my early 20s, moved to Arizona, and built a second life that his children from his first marriage occupied only marginally. I had seen him 4 times in the past decade. We exchanged birthday texts. There had been no animosity, just the slow drift of people whose lives had stopped overlapping. I called Richard Aldrin back from my car in the parking garage. He was professional, measured, and clear. My father had passed away 3 weeks earlier. He had updated his will 2 years prior, and he had left the majority of his estate, including a commercial property in Scottsdale that had appreciated significantly, several investment accounts, and the proceeds of a life insurance policy, to me. The total, approximately $88 million. I sat in my car in the parking garage for a long time. I thought about my father, about the man he had been when I was a child, before the second marriage, before the distance. I thought about the fact that he had apparently been watching from far away in his quiet Arizona life and had decided 2 years ago, for reasons I would probably never fully know, that this was what he wanted to do. I cried in that parking garage, not for the money, for the man I hadn't known well enough to miss properly until he was gone. I called Richard Aldrin back and said I would come to his office that week. I told no one except Margaret and Diane, but Danny found out. I don't know exactly how. Small cities, shared acquaintances, the particular porousness of a social network that has known 2 people as a couple for 12 years. I suspect Greg heard something somewhere, and I don't blame Greg, because he genuinely didn't understand the significance. By the time I received the first call from Carl Brewer, 2 weeks after the estate call, Danny knew. Carl called Margaret. His message was almost poignant in its transparency. Danny had reconsidered the settlement terms, Carl said. He felt that certain aspects of the distribution had been reached under incomplete information, specifically regarding Claire's overall financial picture. He was wondering whether there was any avenue to revisit. Margaret called me immediately after. She read me Carl's message in a flat, precise voice, and when she finished, there was a brief silence. Then she said, He signed the agreement. The divorce is finalized. Illinois courts do not reopen finalized divorce settlements because one party subsequently came into money. The inheritance is yours. It postdates the marriage, and it is entirely, legally, 100% not his. I said, I know. She said, I'm going to enjoy writing this response. She did. Carl's inquiry was answered, politely and conclusively, within 48 hours. Danny called me directly that same week, the first time he had called my personal number since the mediation. I let it ring. He left a voicemail. His voice was controlled at first and then less so. He said he thought we deserved to have a real conversation. He said that after everything they'd been through together, after 12 years, surely. I deleted the message. There was nothing to say to that voice, from that person, at that point in my life. He had made his choice 14 months before that phone call. In the fall, when Renee had started coming to Sunday dinners, when he had decided that what he had with me was worth trading for something else. He had planned it carefully. He had executed it deliberately. And when it had cost him more than he expected, he had tried to pressure me, threaten me, and then, failing that, reach back through a closed door with the language of shared history and expect me to open it. The door was closed. I had closed it myself. I met with Richard Aldrin that week and began the formal process of receiving the estate. It took months. Estate law always does. But the structure was clean, and the documentation was thorough, the way my father had apparently done everything in his Arizona life. I also did something else that week. I called my mother. I told her, calmly and without drama, about the inheritance. I told her that I would not be using it against anyone. I told her that I was going to be fine, more than fine, and that I hoped in time she and I could find our way back to a normal relationship. She cried. She said she was proud of me. I said, Mom, I need you to understand something. I'm not fine because of the money. I'm fine because I refuse to let this break me. The money is separate. She said she understood. I think she did, partially. Some things you can only understand completely by living them. The divorce was final. The estate was in process. The house, my house, on a street in Naperville with a yard that would bloom again in April, was mine. And Danny's call, his voicemail, his scrambling, his transparent attempt to walk back a deal he had signed because the universe had unexpectedly revealed that he had miscalculated the value of the woman he was leaving. That was the last thing he ever got from me. My silence, complete, deliberate, and permanent. By the following October, 14 months after Danny had stood in my kitchen with his rehearsed confession, I was living in a different city, not running, moving. There is a difference, and I understood it clearly. What I actually wanted was not to reclaim the life I'd had, but to build a different one. I sold the Naperville house in June and bought a condo in Denver's Capitol Hill neighborhood. Exposed brick, high ceilings, a writing desk in front of a window that looked out at the mountains on clear days. I had the kitchen done in white oak and matte black, the way I'd always wanted, without negotiating with anyone. I left my architecture firm on good terms and started a small consulting practice, working with 2 architects I had known and respected for years. The inheritance gave me the freedom to be selective, to take only work that interested me. By December, I had 3 clients and a referral list. I was not immediately happy in the clean, uncomplicated way people sometimes describe after difficult periods. Rebuilding is not the same as healed. There were nights when the quiet was too large and moments in ordinary places when something small would surface and I would have to stand still and let it pass. But the shape of my days was good. The work was good. The city was mine. Diane visited for a long weekend in November. We hiked in the foothills, and over dinner she said, "You seem like yourself again. More than you have in years, actually. I had a therapist, Dr. Sarah Keene, direct and unsentimental, who helped me understand things about the marriage that were more complicated than simple betrayal, the ways I had accommodated and minimized long before October. That work was hard and slow and worth every hour. As for Daniel and Renee, they married in the spring after the divorce. I have no feelings about the ceremony itself. Danny's professional trajectory had stalled. The time and money a protracted legal dispute extracts from a person's life is real. He was still at the same company, but the promotions he'd been angling for hadn't come. A man who had burned his stability to pursue something and found that the thing he'd pursued was not the transformation he had imagined. Renee was trying to get a design business off the ground with mixed results. I genuinely hoped she would succeed, but I was not going to call. My mother asked me once whether I thought I'd ever forgive Renee. Forgiveness is internal, I said. I've already stopped being angry. But forgiveness doesn't mean trust, and it doesn't mean closeness. Those things she'd have to earn, and I don't know if she ever will. My mother was quiet. Then, I think your father would have liked who you've become. I looked out at the mountains and held that thought for a long time. In December, I had dinner with a man named Thomas, an architect I'd met through a client. It was not significant yet, just dinner, conversation, the cautious pleasure of finding someone interesting. But I noticed that I was capable of it, that the part of me that could be curious about another person was still intact. That felt like enough. For now, that felt like exactly enough. Looking back, I learned 3 things that I carry with me still. First, the truth, when it comes as a relief. Not the event itself, but the end of the not knowing. Second, composure is not the absence of feeling, it is feeling directed. Third, what people take from you reveals what they believed you were worth. And what you do next reveals what you actually are. If someone had handed you that kitchen moment, that confession, that betrayal, what would you have done? I genuinely want to know. Thank you for listening to this story. If it moved you, if it made you think, leave a comment. And if you know someone who needs to hear it, share it with them.
Thank you for being part of Lyra Echo Stories. If this story stayed with you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share, because every echo never truly fades.